Before we go into some of the details, explain to me why the book and what you're hoping to achieve in whoever the reader is that you've imagined.
Well, there's two issues here. There's the one which is specific to Jews, and the other one is more generally about humanity as a whole. And as far as Jews and Jewishness is concerned, I was very struck by the extent to which the term anti-Semitism, which of course means racism directed at Jews, had changed its meaning. It no longer meant racism directed at Jews because many of the people who were being accused of anti-Semitism were themselves Jewish. What it means is critical of the Israeli state. There's a great deal of difference between being critical of a state and being hostile to a whole people. And then the wider issue is that, this is part of a bigger trend around the world in which people who are fighting racial prejudice are very often accused of being racist themselves. This all started in the 1970s when white men in the U.S. started arguing that if black people were admitted to medical schools in the U.S., that was racist because it was depriving white men of those places at those universities. And it's become very common, we hear about debates about whether, it's racist to want to take down the statues of people who own slaves, for example. So this is very topical in the way it affects Jewish people because of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. But it also applies to this country and to many countries around the world, that very often allegations of racism are directed at the very people who are criticizing racism.
And of course, much of that certainly we can resonate with in this country, right? In the previous hour, I was having a conversation about David Teager, the under-19 cricket player who was stripped of his captaincy ahead of the under-19 World Cup that starts tomorrow. Because in a country like ours, where racism is almost still at the center of the daily discourse, quite frankly, because there's still so much that needs to be addressed. We do sometimes inappropriately and unfairly call each other racist because, as you say, you're calling out an act of racism.
Yeah, we do. And you see, the issues tend to get scrambled up. I mean, if you take this question of David Teager, the cricketer, whatever side you are on that question, I mean, I've heard people say, this is about freedom of religion. It's got absolutely nothing to do with freedom of religion. It's about remarks he made supporting the Israeli army. Now, there's a legitimate argument about whether that should be a problem or not. But whether you think it's a problem or not, it's got absolutely nothing to do with racism, and it's got nothing to do with discrimination against Jewish people. There's no problem about Jewish people doing anything in this country, but, there are people who feel very strongly that somebody who supports what's going on in Gaza at the moment is not an appropriate person to captain a national team.
Let's explore then your exploration, excuse the double use of the word there, of how the West particularly is reflecting on the brutality that Ukrainians are feeling as compared to the brutality that the Palestinians are feeling. Why the difference?
Well, that's really at the heart of what I'm trying to show in the book, because, you say to yourself, well, why are Jewish people being accused of hating Jews? Why are people who criticize what the Israeli state is doing in Gaza being accused of being racist? And more importantly, in terms of your question, why do Western governments enthusiastically support this? Well, the answer is that colonialism, unfortunately, is not dead, and prejudice is not dead. And in the minds of Western governments, the Israeli state is a Western state. They talk about it as the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, it's doubtful whether a country can be a democracy, if it's got thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who it governs who don't have the vote. But what they really mean is it's the only Western state in the Middle East. And because they feel that the Israeli state is Western, it deserves support. Ukraine is a very interesting example of this prejudice because, of course, everything that the West says about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is true. It is illegal, it is immoral, but it's no different to what is happening in Palestine. In fact, it's no different to what the Russians did in Syria and in Chechnya, which is a Muslim enclave in Russia. But when the Russians bombed Chechnya and Syria, the West was fine with it. When they bombed Ukraine, the West became upset because they see Ukraine as Western as they are. And they see the Israeli state in the same way. So, what is done to Palestinians is simply regarded as defending the Western way of life and is therefore acceptable.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And another aspect of the extract I was reading in the conversation today is, and I never thought of this, that colonialism existed where generally Europeans would explore the world, find land, colonize it, and obviously we know the history books, but that the spate, I suppose, and the experience of the Jewish nation or Jewish people in Europe was seen as a way of almost transferring that colonialism back to Europe, which Europeans were not too pleased about.
Well, exactly. You see, originally, there've been many Jewish people who've never lived in Europe or that had anything to do with Europe. But at the same time, there was quite a lot of Jewish settlement in Europe. And European politicians and people who held power in Europe sort of recognized that the Jews were there, but they really didn't regard them as people who belonged there. They were always outsiders to a certain extent. They were discriminated against in all sorts of ways. And it was only when this Western state was formed in the Middle East that the West decided that Jews were part of the West and therefore deserved the support that they received at the moment. So it's really, the irony is that Zionism, which is the movement which created the State of Israel, Zionism always says that it's actually, enabling Jewish people to express themselves as Jews. What it's actually done is created a situation where Jews are now regarded as white Europeans. And that entitles them to all sorts of things in Europe. But that's not really the same as becoming independent and expressing yourself. Really, and of course the other point that needs to be made is that in many cases, the prejudices which used to be directed at Jews are now transferred to Muslims. So the fact that the majority of Palestinians are Muslim then becomes another excuse to exclude them from a kind of consideration which is afforded to Ukrainians.
Steven, I can't wait to read the rest of the book. Thank you very much for making the time to talk to us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Professor Steven Friedman, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism and the Assault on Meaning, published by Wits University Press.